Welcome to the Com Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today is September 28th, and there are a lot of important news stories. In this episode, 50 missiles and hundreds of drones, one of the most massive attacks on Ukraine. It sank twice. The Russian submarine Novorossiysk is burning from the inside. And once again, Poland is under drone attack. Warsaw airport is closed. Drones are now nearly colliding with passenger planes, even over the Netherlands. And Sweden and Finland are forming a strike brigade against Russia. How the Kremlin turned the church in Moldova into a real weapon. Xi Jinping demands that Trump surrender Taiwan, while Trump himself justifies Hungary and Slovakia for using Russian oil. We'll talk about this and much more. It's going to be an eventful and interesting episode. So, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So, 50 missiles and almost 600. The Fascist Federation launched 50 missiles and almost 600 drones at Ukraine. Unfortunately, there are casualties. In Kyiv, 4 people were killed, including a 12-year-old girl. My condolences to the families and loved ones who lost someone today, and I wish a speedy recovery to those who were injured. The Russians have already reported through their Ministry of Defense that they supposedly targeted some military objectives and so on. Well, just look at where they hit. A bread factory in Fastiv, an apartment building in Zaporizhia, the Institute of Cardiology here in Kyiv, a winery in Odessa, a kindergarten in the Darnitsky district of Kyiv. And these are far from all the sites that this fascist federation targeted today with its drones and missiles. At the Institute of Cardiology, unfortunately, a nurse and a patient were killed. So what now? Will there be a new expression of concern? From what I felt, this was probably the most massive attack on Kyiv. It started in the evening and lasted until after 9 in the morning. They came in waves, wave after wave, everything was shaking and so on. In the morning, these poor children sleep deprived with their toys, people coming out with their carriers. And what will we hear this time from across the big, beautiful ocean? That once again, Putin, I'm dissatisfied, Putin shouldn't be shelling. Yes, or that this isn't our war. If it were our war, of course, we would win. By the way, speaking of whether it's our war or not, it's yours, very much yours. One of the reasons why Putin allowed himself to attack is that Ukraine lost its nuclear status. And that very president who promised that the US would protect Ukraine, Bill Clinton, recently said in an interview that this is our war, we promised to protect them, we disarmed Ukraine. So Germany only finished paying off its last reparations debts in 2010. Those who were paying by then could definitely have said, this isn't our war, we have nothing to do with that war at all. That's not how it works. This is my war. I'll get a peace prize for this one, but that one isn't my war because it's complicated and I don't want to deal with it. It seems to me that when you become President of the United States, it's strange to pick and choose, to play golf and do pleasant things, but say, no, I don't want to deal with the unpleasant ones. By the way, Ukraine would gladly trade back that piece of paper, the Budapest Memorandum, for a nuclear arsenal or its modern equivalents. So yes. So basically, while Donald Trump wakes up, plays golf, and thinks about how to say he's once again unhappy, it seems that in Russia they've decided to finish off their own fleet themselves, what Ukraine didn't finish off. So Russia is hiding an emergency on the submarine Novorossiysk. The vessel is in the Mediterranean Sea. And as for the submarine of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, it was sent there apparently because they didn't want it to share the fate of the submarine Rostov-on-Don, which was successfully destroyed by the Ukrainian armed forces. And now, on this submarine, the fuel system has been damaged, fuel is leaking directly inside, and naturally the sub can no longer carry out its combat missions. This creates a critical safety threat. In other words, it could blow up there. Of course, this isn't the Kursk, but still. By the way, do you remember the Kursk? That was just when Putin had come to power. And it seems to me, even now, when you look at that psychopathic expression on his face, that wondering smile as he says, it sank. Really, yes, 118 Russians were trapped there, just sitting alive, let me remind you. There were survivors left on the Kursk submarine. Putin didn't even interrupt his vacation, his holiday. He was riding a jet ski, not a quad bike. I mean, he was jet skiing somewhere in Sochi. He lied, and lied again. They could have saved those sailors, but they were afraid that the Norwegians and the British would somehow discover some secrets, so they only let them in after 8 days. And just imagine, they were even pretending that there were some noises coming from inside the compartments, as if the sailors were knocking from within, when in fact they were already dead, and it was actually Russian divers making the noises. They're just insane, honestly. So, after 8 days, they finally let the Norwegians and the British in, and they opened the hatch, even though they could have opened it right away and maybe saved someone. But on the other hand, everything from the Russian military junk that sank isn't taking part in this war, and it won't be involved in any future ones either. So really, there's no sympathy. It's just about Putin's behavior, how unhinged he was when he came to power and how much more unhinged he is now. Honestly, in September 99, he and Patrushev were blowing up apartment buildings in Russia. Remember the Ryazan sugar incident? They killed 300 people, including Russians and children, just to justify the war in Chechnya. And less than 6 months later, he was already smiling and saying, "It sank." That was in 2000. So Nemtsov was right. He was absolutely right. I think that in his old age, Putin has seriously overestimated his own abilities. But most importantly, he underestimated the resilience of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. By the way, I don't think anyone doubts that if Putin had managed to seize Ukraine in a blitz, he wouldn't have stopped there. I believe they would have immediately moved into Moldova and planned to go even further. And of course the Baltic countries as well, there's no doubt about it. I recently saw an interview with some security official from Moldova, and he said that the Russians called them and said, "We'll be there in a few hours." Specifically, they called Maya Sandu, and told her, "We'll be there in a few hours." Yes, that's how they gave their warning. Lavrov and Ryabkov, in the first days of the full-scale invasion, were saying that NATO should pull back to the 1997 borders. They had been saying this even before, but look, here was the plan. What does it mean that NATO was supposed to pull back? Basically, they thought they'd take Ukraine in a blitz, move into Moldova and then Hungary and so on. And as for the Baltic countries, there was another group assigned to deal with them, as well as Romania and so on. So what does it mean for NATO to pull back to the 1997 borders? Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, then the Baltic states, then Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia to leave NATO. Why were these particular demands made? Because there was a dream of restoring some new version of the Soviet Union? And you know, the ambition was to once again gather the countries of the Warsaw Pact under their wing and then somehow divide up Europe like that. That's how it was, so that was the plan. And it was Ukraine that became the stumbling block for Putin. He would choke on it and die, you see. He wanted to erase 30 years of history to return to the division of Europe as it was in the late Soviet era. Those were his plans. And at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, after, well, you remember, Georgia was there too, he was telling people behind the scenes that without Ukraine there is no Russian Empire. So even back then, and Bill Clinton, whom I already mentioned, realized in 2011, he said so in an interview, that a Russian invasion of Ukraine was inevitable. And that's exactly what happened. Well, Putin always called Ukraine fake, non-existent, made up, but now it turns out that this so-called fake state has put 1 million, even more than 1 million Russians into its very real soil. And Putin simply doesn't know how to get out of this war anymore. He simply doesn't know. If the coalition of the resolute were just a bit more resolute, they would have already chased that mangy scum with rags beyond the Urals, and all his replicants would be fleeing from every bunker in all directions. They would be caught and sent to The Hague. The more we surrender, the better, as in that one famous movie. Well, that's not all about the Russian submarine. There was another incident that surfaced, quite an unusual one. Now you'll see just how impressive Ukrainian drones are. A Russian missile ship was fleeing from Ukrainian drones and crashed into a tanker. This incident happened in the Sea of Azov. It happened in August, but the documents have only just surfaced now. Here is that small missile ship, the Vyshny Voloshyok, a carrier of Kaliber missiles. It was fleeing from drones and crashed into a tanker. The tanker is called Nazan in the Temryok Bay of the Sea of Azov. So, well, this is a whole new level, I have to say. Can you imagine the power of Ukrainian drones? I mean, not even a drone fragment was involved here. Just the mere sight of Ukrainian drones made the Russian small missile ship take itself out. Yes, this is serious. By the way, friends, let me remind you, we have an important fundraiser for the legendary 3rd Assault Brigade. The commander from the 3rd Assault Brigade has addressed us. Please take a look.
Hello, friends. My call sign is Taubad. I am the commander of the Povsta crew of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, FPV Strike Company. I'm reaching out to the viewers of Boris Tizengauzen's channel with a request to contribute to the fundraiser for Matrice 30 daytime drones. These are large quadcopters and we need them for reconnaissance. They also perform some other very interesting functions. The fundraising goal is significant, 1,100,000 hryvnias. We are counting on your support, on your help. Thanks to them, we will be able to destroy the enemy even more effectively and bring Ukraine's victory closer. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.
Let's help our soldiers. I think it's right to turn our hatred for these inhumans, whenever possible, into support for our soldiers who, believe me, will avenge every Ukrainian, every child's tear. The link to donate is in the description of this video and also in the comments. There are private, mono and PayPal options for those who want to help from abroad. If you don't see it, there's a QR code right here in the description that leads directly to the fundraiser. Let's help our heroes, and believe me, their revenge will truly be terrifying. On September 10th, it turns out that 92 drones were flying toward Poland, but only 19 managed to cross the Polish border. The rest were shot down by Ukraine. This was stated by Volodymyr Zelensky. Let me remind you, at that time, Poland shot down 4 out of the 19 drones and did so at a very high cost using missiles from aircraft. And one of them even hit a house along with the plane. So Warsaw's main airport, Chopin Airport, was closed for arrivals and departures until this morning. The reasons have not been disclosed. And now an unidentified drone is flying again. Now they're penetrating further and further, deeper and deeper each time. It came within 50 meters of a passenger plane, a plane that was coming into land. At Amsterdam Airport in the Netherlands, a runway was closed for landings and flights were redirected to other airports. There are now far more drone incidents, and not a day goes by without one being reported somewhere. And look, some interesting details are coming to light. I've gathered all the information about drones from eyewitnesses over Sweden and Denmark, Norway. And some eyewitnesses say that the drones were quite large and flashed red and green lights. I wonder, why would drones need navigation lights like on aircraft, red on one wing, green on the other, so you can see which way they're flying? Why do drones need these navigation lights? And they're flashing too. Well, obviously, if it's a reconnaissance drone, why would it flash and draw attention to itself? But maybe that was exactly the point, to attract attention so that everyone who needed to would see these drones. And the Russians... This is the Overton window, and I think no one has any doubt about who's behind all of this. And with the severed cables on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, and with the drones, 20 of them, 19 ending up in Poland by accident, and with the airspace violations, I think no one has any doubts. So, look, as I mentioned yesterday, Zakharova, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, comes out of hibernation and makes a statement. It turns out that Ukraine supposedly wants to restore several Russian drones, pack them with explosives and launch them into Poland and Romania, then say, look, Russia did this. So Zakharova is citing Hungarian media, big shout out to the pterodactyl of peace Orban, and is saying this kind of nonsense. And this is a classic Overton window when Europe won't even have time to look back before drones with warheads are flying over their heads over their homes and it becomes the norm. In other words, it's the Overton window, when the discourse shifts from what once seemed unthinkable. Sorry, my tongue's a bit twisted after a night like this. By the way, Sometimes I think, okay, pull yourself together, maybe you'll miss something, maybe not. No, Boris, I think you're a schizoid, you were like that as a child. You used to love drawing in every little square for a really long time. Wherever they sat me down, I would sit there and draw all sorts of pictures in the squares of my notebook. So what am I even talking about? Yeah, and that's when the discourse starts to shift. Look at what happened. At first, individual drones would enter the airspace of NATO countries. Remember in Romania, Poland? The next stage. Dozens of drones are now deliberately flying in, but without warheads, just these gerunds. That's where Europe is right now. The next stage is when a drone with a warhead flies into a NATO country, maybe into some logistics hub, or maybe not even a logistics hub yet. And the Russians say, well, we told you, the Ukrainians shot down the drone, reassembled it, and launched it themselves. So what? What's the problem? And the next stage is that drones with warheads will regularly start hitting military targets. Russia will just keep a poker face, that's all. In other words, that's exactly where they're heading. And they'll only stop where they're forced to stop. Yeah. And now news from the racetrack. Lavrov made a statement. By the way, there's a very interesting point here. Lavrov started talking about these drones, about the Gerens that flew in, and cited a number of facts saying like, it's not us, not Russia, we don't know anything about it. The drones are ours, but it wasn't us. So Lavrov stated that Russia has no plans to attack NATO countries and is not launching its drones in European countries. Well, yes, we heard from Putin that he wasn't going to attack us and that he didn't need Crimea. We've all heard that. Look at the argument Lavrov is making. The drones that were found on Polish territory have a shorter flight range than the distance from that territory to the Russian border. Russia would never direct its UAVs or missiles at EU or NATO countries, Lavrov stated. Look, he measured from the territory of the Russian Federation, but he forgot that the Kaliningrad region is also, for now, still a part of the Russian Federation. So for some reason he probably deliberately kept that fact out of his mind, because I found a map where the debris of these drones was found. And lo and behold, one of the drones was found right up north, right on the border with the Kaliningrad region. One of the drones, some of the drones, 4 pieces of debris, were found right on the border with Belarus, but they also found more inside Poland. So the Gerbera, which has a range of 300 kilometers, can easily reach from either Belarus or the Kaliningrad region. That's where they were found. Then if you attach additional fuel tanks, it can even fly up to 700 kilometers. So Lavrov is a blabbermouth and a vile scoundrel, let's put it that way today. And he also accused Western countries of wanting to cease to attack the Kaliningrad region. Oh, just calm down already. It's clear that it's not yours, that Königsberg isn't yours, but no one is planning to attack you. For now, it's this battered Russian Federation that's attacking everyone and still won't stop. Yeah, it just won't die off there. God, I think when it finally dies, probably half the world on that very day, at that very moment, will just pop open champagne, I'm telling you for sure. Well, as for NATO, how am I supposed to call them now? I don't even know. Let's put it this way. NATO are our allies. NATO is doing a great job, but they underestimate a good musical moose, as prescribed by Putin, when he becomes docile and crawls back into his bald jellyfish lair, that creep. NATO does not rule out that Russian MiG-31 fighter jets entered Estonia by mistake. Well, they don't rule it out, obviously. But here too, we need to understand that when we say NATO, it's a very heterogeneous, very diverse structure. Some rule it out and some don't. So, the idea that 3 fighter jets somehow didn't know where their corridor was with modern navigation systems? Well, sure. And Mark Rutte also trolled the Russian Federation, referencing the fact that Trump called it a paper tiger. He said that afterwards the Russians started saying, "We're not a tiger, we're a bear, bears can't be paper," and so on. But Rutte also said, listen, if you really are a bear, everyone will notice that anyway, you don't need to explain it. It's like the bear just attacked Ukraine and doesn't know what to do, this bear. Well, if I were in the place of our NATO partners, I would troll less and do more, give Ukraine everything that can be given. Believe me, everything will hit the target exactly. In fact, Putin has already lost this war over NATO's non-expansion. What he wanted to roll back to the 1997 borders and so on, he completely lost that. Well, NATO for the poor, this CSTO, doesn't even compare to the alliance, and I think everyone understands that perfectly well. And two new NATO countries, thanks to Putin, by the way, they should give him these pennants. Sweden and Finland have formed a strike brigade on the border with Russia. If anyone understands, it's Finland. Finland went through almost the same thing with the Soviet Union. The Winter War very similar, and the occupation of part of its territory, a much larger enemy attacked and ended up disgraced. It's exactly the same as what Russia is going through now. And good for them, forming these strike brigades in Lapland. I was actually in Lapland a month before the full-scale invasion. I saw the beautiful northern lights there, the wonderful aurora. And we were already on our way back, everything was already like that. It was pre-war, the Germans were already flying their planes away. We didn't board our flight, or rather, they didn't want to fly to Ukraine anymore, some airlines, yes. So we came back, and yes. And the scum attacked us, my God, well. It seems to me that if someone lives better, if someone is just independent, it just wants to ruin it. It doesn't want to share anything, or it wants to drag its Russian world here. Well, maybe it does want to, of course, but it won't take root here. It just doesn't want people abroad to live better. And it just infuriates them. Well, if they can't reach it, they just say, oh, it's all just gays over there and everything is terrible. I think it's just that before the war, when I traveled a lot, everywhere we went with my wife, doesn't matter, from Trolltunga to Machu Picchu, I always ran into these white dandelions. I called them dandelions. Their hairstyles are like that, German retirees. They have this white hair, all of them like little dandelions. Everywhere. They just retire and can afford to do whatever they want. But what about Russian retirees? What can they even afford? But amazingly, they'll still shout, Putin is the president of the world. They'll mumble with those toothless mouths of theirs, calling him our benefactor, but they'll worship him. Not all of them, of course, not all. And then there's the work of agents, and by the way, the church plays a huge role in this, in the way their demons come out at the mention of Putin's name, recruitment, the FSB branch, which is also the Russian Orthodox Church. They've turned religion into a weapon. For example, they've hired Moldovan priests. By the way, let me remind you, elections are being held today, and the path Moldova takes will depend on the outcome. In other words, it will either be sucked into the cozy, murky, warm swamp of the Russian world, or it will choose the European path. Basically, the Putin regime has placed an incredible bet, poured a ton of money into these elections, and hired priests. So what did they do? They brought priests from Moldova to Russia, took them around to some important places, gave them cards with money, gave them vouchers and certificates, so that they could redeem these certificates in church shops, and not only there. And in doing so, they were essentially recruiting these Moldovan priests, turning them into an agent network. And then a mandatory condition was to open a Telegram channel, gather all their followers there, and periodically publish anti-Western materials. So the investigation showed that 90% of such channels were created by these priests. You see, that's only what they've managed to find. That's why Ukraine's experience should probably serve as a lesson for everyone. In other words, this whole agent network nonsense needs to be thrown out of the country. This evil is sometimes even worse than the propagandists themselves. At least the propagandists don't hide that they're fanatics, but these people hide behind religion, God, and so on. Xi Jinping is demanding that Donald Trump give up Taiwan as a condition for concluding a trade deal between the countries. A deal he's even twitching his eye over it. The Wall Street Journal reports this, citing government sources familiar with the course of the negotiations. In other words, Xi is demanding that Trump make an official statement opposing Taiwan's independence. Let me remind you, almost no one has recognized Taiwan's independence, but, well, and they even talk about the One China policy. But here's the catch. So Xi plans to use trade negotiations with the United States as leverage. Renounce it publicly. Say it, that's it, Taiwan is China. Just say it like that and that's all. And Trump really needs rare earth metals. Listen, he would trade anything for rare earth elements. Seriously. The system for restraining evil in this world no longer works. Everyone is out for themselves now. In other words, you can trade with whoever you want. Those are the new rules. A murderer, a dictator, I don't know, a corrupter. What difference does it make what crimes they've committed? Trade. They have rare earth metals. That's the criterion for judgment now. It's insane. Somehow it just seems to me that... Yeah. I don't even know what I added. So Trump called not to blame Hungary and Slovakia for buying oil from Russia. I thought, how come? Look, Orban comes out and says we're independent and sovereign here, we're surrounded, and we have no access to the sea. We're going to buy Russian oil. We'll kiss Putin's ass no matter what you do to us. And Trump, who says, I won't impose sanctions while Europe is buying Russian oil, now says, oh, but Hungary and Slovakia can keep buying. After all, they have no alternative. But in reality, of course, there is an alternative. I just don't want people to blame them, says Trump. Well, you get it, right? Yesterday he says one thing, today another, tomorrow something else. A man of chaos? A man of chaos. By the way, what's going on with the sanctions against Russia? Someone claims they're imposing tough ones, like, I'm tough, I'm going to impose such harsh sanctions now. Where? Show them to me. And by the way, show Donald Trump the Czech Republic and Austria on the map, and show him that they also have no access to the sea, but they manage just fine and were able to give up Russian oil. And you, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Let's help and support our soldiers. The fundraiser, just a reminder, is in the description. Wishing us all a peaceful day and, of course, glory to Ukraine.